12 years, and this is what loyalty gets you. A man who needed my family's name just...
Is that the final decision, the official record, Chelsea?
I've never been more certain in my life.
This card says Vincent Lowry, VP of Operations. Not anymore. You don't get to sit at this table and act like you still have a say.
Sign whatever you want, Chelsea, but read what's inside this first. I do, Chelsea. By 6:15 this morning, I owned 82% of your company.
12 years, and this is what loyalty gets you. A man who needed my family's name just to hold down a job. Chelsea said it straight into the wireless microphone, her voice crisp and amplified across the high-ceilinged event space in Midtown Houston. 50 local reporters, food bloggers, and industry investors sat in rows of velvet chairs, smartphones raised, recording every word. The backdrop behind the stage read, Bishop Culinary Group, the next generation, in glossy white lettering. Chelsea looked stunning in a fitted red dress, her hair swept back, every inch the polished chief executive. She turned her eyes toward me, where I stood quietly near the side exit in my plain, navy blue suit. "This company doesn't need you anymore, Vincent," she continued, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Hand over your keycard and walk out." The room went dead silent. Flashbulbs flickered, catching the slight smirk on Derrick Pratt's face. Derrick was 32, wore a patterned designer suit that screamed loud money, and held the official title of Brand Transformation Specialist. Over the last 4 months, he'd managed to convince Chelsea that he was a business genius, and that I was dead, weight holding her back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I reached inside my breast pocket, took out my silver master keycard, and walked slowly to the edge of the stage. I laid the keycard on the display table next to her microphone stand. Alongside it, I placed a thick, sealed white envelope. "Is that the final decision you want on the official record, Chelsea?" I asked. She let out a dry, dismissive laugh into the microphone. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." What Chelsea didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except the quiet woman sitting in the back row, holding a leather briefcase, was that at 6:15 a.m. that very morning, my attorney, Diane Yates, had filed the final transfer documents with the state registry. Through an entity called Fieldstone Holdings, funded entirely by licensing revenues Chelsea had spent years ignoring, I had purchased the defaulted banknotes of Bishop Culinary Group. By 6:15 a.m., I didn't just work for the company. I owned 82% of its voting shares and held every dollar of its primary debt. She thought she was embarrassing her washed-up husband in front of the press. In reality, she was handing over control of her father's legacy to the man she had just publicly thrown away. My father, Otis Lowry, ran a small butcher shop on the south side of Houston for 35 years. He was a broad-shouldered man who worked 14-hour days in cold rooms, smelling of sawdust and raw beef. He never made a fortune, but he paid his bills on time and never owed a dime to anyone. "Vincent," he told me when I was 16, wiping down the heavy wooden butcher block at the end of a shift. "A real man does his work careful and quiet. You don't need to shout about what you built if the frame is square and the joints fit. Tight. Do the job right, and don't make excuses for taking pride in it." I took that advice with me to college and into my career as a systems engineer. I spent 15 years designing operational logic, automated inventory pipelines, and cold chain supply monitoring for industrial manufacturing plants. I liked system logic because it didn't lie. If a conveyor belt stopped or a batch spoiled, it wasn't because of bad luck or bad feelings. It was because someone missed a failure point in the design. I met Chelsea Bishop 12 years ago at a business conference in Austin. She was vibrant, ambitious, and deeply proud of her father, Harold Bishop, who had built Bishop Culinary Group from a single upscale steakhouse into a respected chain of 6 regional restaurants and a specialty food processing plant. Harold was a real food man, tough, fair, and meticulous about quality. When Harold suffered a massive stroke 7 years ago that left him bedridden, the company started taking water. Chelsea had a degree in communications and marketing. She was brilliant at public relations, securing press coverage, and styling the brand image, but she knew nothing about food logistics, warehouse refrigeration, vendor contracts, or yield margins. I watched her drown for 3 months. She was working 18 hours a day, coming home crying because meat shipments were arriving spoiled at the Midtown location, or supplier prices were spiking by 20% without warning. Nobody asked me to step in, but she was my wife, and I loved her. So I resigned from my comfortable $180,000 a year engineering position at an industrial firm, took the title of VP of Operations at Bishop Culinary Group, and quietly went to work. Within 18 months, I rebuilt their entire supply chain from the floor up. I replaced 3 corrupt local distributors who were overcharging Harold by 15% on wholesale prime cuts. I personally re-engineered the main warehouse's walk-in freezer monitoring systems, eliminating an annual stock spoilage rate that had been costing the company $300,000 every year. I worked in the back. I wore work boots and canvas jackets, spent my mornings on loading docks checking temperature logs, and sat at my desk until 8 p.m. balancing vendor ledgers. Meanwhile, Chelsea took the front stage. She did TV interviews, appeared on magazine covers as Houston's rising female entrepreneur, and accepted business awards on behalf of the company. I was fine with that arrangement. I didn't need the spotlight. I thought we were a team, her on the microphone, me on the machinery. But over the last 2 years, something shifted. The quiet respect in our home turned into polite distance, and then into subtle contempt. Chelsea started coming home late, talking exclusively about brand equity, social media metrics, and elite networking circles. Her mother, Joanne Bishop, didn't help. Joanne was a 63-year-old socialite who viewed her late husband's business as a personal checking account for her country club dues. She never liked me. To Joanne, I wasn't an engineer who saved her family's company. I was just a blue-collar guy from a butcher's family who had married above his station. At a family dinner at Joanne's house 6 months ago, Joanne looked across the dining table, lowered her wine glass, and said right in front of Chelsea, "Vincent is a useful man to have around the kitchen freezer, but let's be honest, he only has a seat at this table because he married into the right surname." I looked at Chelsea, expecting her to defend me, or at least push back. She didn't say a word. She just cut her steak and took a sip of water. That was the night I realized my marriage wasn't just cold. It was completely hollow. While Chelsea was busy managing her public persona and hosting networking dinners, I was spending my late nights in a small rented workshop near the industrial port of East Houston. My background in systems engineering had taught me one fundamental truth about fresh food logistics. Degradation is rarely an all-at-once event. It is a compounding process triggered by micro-fluctuations in moisture, atmospheric pressure, and surface temperature during handling. Traditional processing plants solve this by dumping chemical preservatives onto produce and meat cuts, or freezing them solid, which ruined the texture and flavor profile high-end restaurants demanded. I spent 4 years developing a non-chemical preservation framework. It combined specialized sensor arrays, automated humidity adjustments, and a patented microfiltered airflow technique that extended the shelf life of raw meats and organic produce by nearly triple the industry standard, without altering taste or texture. I called it Harvest Line Technologies. I didn't start it to make a point or build an empire. I started it because I saw a flaw in how food was moved and stored, and I wanted to fix it. 3 years ago, I brought an early prototype setup to our home kitchen on a Saturday morning. I had spent 6 months testing it on prime cuts of ribeye and organic greens. I set 2 plates on the counter. One held a cut of beef preserved using standard refrigeration for 6 days. The other held a cut treated with Harvest Line logic for 16 days. The difference was night and day. The standard cut was discolored and dry at the edges. The Harvest Line cut looked like it had been sliced 30 minutes prior. Chelsea walked into the kitchen wearing her gym clothes, holding a green smoothie. I smiled and started explaining the sensor data and humidity control ratios. "Look at this, Chelsea," I said, pointing to the testing log. "If we deploy this across our central processing facility, We won't just save money on spoilage. We can package and supply fresh specialty inventory to high-end venues across 3 neighboring states. She didn't even lean in to look at the plates. She took a sip of her smoothie, checked her phone, and gave me a patronizing smile. "That's very clever, Vincent," she said, tapping her screen. "It's a cute little side project. Just make sure you don't let it distract you from your actual duties at the office. We have a big supplier meeting with Texas Prime Beef next week, and I need you to verify those shipping manifests." She turned around and walked out of the kitchen before I could show her the cost-benefit analysis I had printed out. I didn't argue. I packed up the equipment, put it in my trunk, and kept working on it quietly during my nights and weekends. By the following year, Harvest Line was ready for commercial rollout. I didn't push it on Bishop Culinary Group again. Instead, I quietly set up an independent LLC and began pitching the technology to regional food packing plants, independent butcher chains, and organic grocers across Texas. The market response was overwhelming. Plant managers who had been losing hundreds of thousands of dollars to premature spoilage jumped at the licensing agreements. Within 18 months, Harvest Line was integrated into 32 commercial food processing and distribution facilities across the state. The licensing royalties began pouring into a dedicated corporate account, money I barely touched, choosing instead to reinvest it into secure financial instruments and corporate debt acquisition. Twice during that period, as I noticed Bishop Culinary Group's profit margins tightening, I tried to present Harvest Line's performance to Chelsea. I wanted her to see that we could integrate the technology directly into her family's business and generate an entirely new revenue stream that would secure the company for decades. The first time was in my home office. I opened my laptop and pulled up the quarterly licensing summary. "Chelsea, take 5 minutes to look at these revenue numbers. Harvest Line generated over $600,000 in pure high-margin licensing this quarter alone." She was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting her earrings for a charity gala. She glanced at the screen for 2 seconds, shrugged, and said, "Vincent, I really don't have time for your hobbies right now. We're trying to figure out how to reposition our brand identity in the inner loop. Nobody in our target demographic cares about warehouse refrigeration mechanics." The second time, 3 months later, I tried again over breakfast. She interrupted me before I finished my first slide, switching the topic to her upcoming magazine feature. After that, I stopped bringing it up. Meanwhile, Bishop Culinary Group was heading into serious trouble. Over an 18-month span, the company lost 2 lucrative corporate catering accounts to nimbler regional competitors. 3 major local banks, reviewing our declining cash flow reserves, refused to extend our primary lines of credit. The fundamental issue wasn't the food quality. It was Chelsea's refusal to control overhead expenses, coupled with a lack of operational discipline at the top. Instead of addressing the root cause, Chelsea panicked. And that was when she met Derrick Pratt. Derrick arrived at the company 4 months ago as a brand transformation specialist. He was 32, wore tailored patterned suits, and carried himself with an overbearing confidence that masked a complete lack of operational knowledge. He didn't know the difference between a wholesale, yield index, and a prime cost percentage, but he knew exactly how to speak to Chelsea's deepest insecurity. Chelsea's biggest fear, a fear her mother Joanne constantly poked at, was that the business community viewed her as nothing more than Harold Bishop's daughter, living off her father's reputation. Derrick seized on that fear immediately. He spent hours in Chelsea's corner office, telling her that the company's outdated image was my fault. He convinced her that my blue-collar operational focus was dragging down the brand's luxury appeal. "You're a visionary, Chelsea," I overheard Derrick telling her through the partially open door of her office one afternoon. "You shouldn't be bogged down by warehouse logic or supply chain numbers. Vincent operates like an old-school butcher shop manager. He's a shadow operator holding you back from making this company truly yours." Within 6 weeks of Derrick's arrival, I was quietly uninvited from executive board meetings. Strategic emails stopped including my address. When I asked Chelsea about it, she coldly told me that Derrick was leading a streamlined leadership vision, and that my presence in high-level brand meetings was counterproductive to our new direction. I was being erased from the company I had spent 7 years keeping alive. Because I had built Bishop Culinary Group's digital infrastructure from scratch 7 years prior, every server log, database query, and automated security alert still routed through my secondary system backup. I never used this access to spy on anyone. It was simply standard operational protocol, a safety net against data loss or external breaches. 4 weeks before the launch event, my automated monitor flagged an unusual sequence of high-volume data downloads from our secure administrative server. Someone had requested full export privileges for our 3 most sensitive databases: the proprietary recipe specifications, the master corporate client contact registry, and the full 10-year Tier 1 vendor pricing history. None of those files had anything to do with brand marketing, social media campaigns, or visual redesigns. I opened the system access logs and checked the credentials. The request had been generated using Derrick Pratt's newly issued administrative profile. I sat at my desk in the quiet warehouse office at 9 p.m., watching the data transfer indicators on my screen. A legitimate brand consultant needed demographics, customer survey results, and media kits. A consultant who asks for unencrypted vendor cost structures and client margin histories is doing something else entirely. He is conducting due diligence for a transfer. Instead of confronting Derrick immediately, I used my administrative privileges to trace the destination of the outgoing data packets. What I found was far worse than simple corporate incompetence. Derrick had created a private external server under a Delaware-registered entity called Apex Culinary Partners. Over the preceding 21 days, he had been in daily encrypted email communication with Marcus Vance, the chief operating officer of Vance Hospitality, Bishop Culinary Group's largest and most aggressive direct competitor in the Gulf Coast region. I spent 6 hours reading through recovered email chains, draft term sheets, and internal memos. The plan Derrick had constructed was brutally efficient. He had convinced Chelsea to authorize a massive, unhedged financial outlay for the upcoming product launch event, draining our remaining cash reserves to less than 48 hours of operational liquidity. Simultaneously, Derrick was finalizing an exclusive IP assignment agreement with Vance Hospitality. Under the terms of the draft contract, Apex Culinary Partners, Derrick's entity, would acquire the exclusive commercial rights to our proprietary recipes and client contracts for a fraction of their market value. Vance Hospitality would then step in to rescue the distribution network, leaving Bishop Culinary Group saddled with hundreds of thousands of dollars in event debt, while its primary core assets were transferred out from under it. Chelsea was listed in the draft documents as a minority equity partner in Apex Culinary Partners. A seat promised to her after her divorce from me was finalized. Derrick was setting her up to destroy her father's company, bankrupt her own legacy, and hand the remains to our biggest rival, all while convincing her it was a brilliant strategic move. I printed out 40 pages of server logs, email transcripts, and contract drafts. I bound them neatly in a manila folder, walked upstairs to Chelsea's office, and closed the door behind me. It was 7:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. Chelsea was sitting at her glass desk, reviewing swatch samples for the press event backdrop. She looked up, her expression immediately hardening into irritation. "Vincent, I'm extremely busy," she said, without putting down her pen. "Derrick and I have a media strategy briefing in 20 minutes. "You need to look at this, Chelsea," I said quietly, placing the folder directly on top of her fabric swatches. She didn't open it. She just looked at the cover of the folder, then back up at me with an exhausted, condescending sigh. "What is it now? Another complaint about freezer maintenance budgets? Or are you going to complain again that Derrick isn't submitting his expense receipts through your old-fashioned forms?" "Derrick is stealing the company," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "Those pages contain verified server logs from the last 3 weeks. Derrick has exported our entire corporate client database, our recipe specifications, and our vendor pricing structures to Vance Hospitality's executive team. He's setting up a shell company to strip our assets the night before your press event." Chelsea stared at me for 3 long seconds. Then she let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "Vance Hospitality?" she sneered, tossing her pen onto the desk. "Are you serious right now, Vincent? You are so transparent, it's actually embarrassing. Read the emails, Chelsea. Read page 14. She pushed the folder away from her with the back of her hand, refusing to open it. "I don't need to read your desperate little fabrications. Do you have any idea how sad you look right now? Ever since Derrick came in here with actual vision and energy, all you've done is sulk in the warehouse because nobody looks to you as the smartest person in the room anymore." "This isn't about my pride," I said. "This is about your father's company. If Derrick signs that agreement with Marcus Vance, Bishop Culinary Group will be insolvent by the end of next month." Chelsea stood up, her face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare bring my father into this. Derrick is trying to save this brand while you've been content to let us stall out as a mid-tier local operation. You're terrified of change because you know that in a real, modern corporate environment, a guy with a butcher shop background who talks about inventory logs doesn't belong at the head table." She walked around her desk and stood inches from me, her eyes cold with absolute certainty. "Derrick has done more for my confidence and this company's future in 4 months than you've done in 12 years, she spat out. "Take your pathetic little folder and get out of my office." I looked at her face. I saw no trace of the woman I had married 12 years ago, only vanity, insecurity, and an arrogant certainty that made her completely blind to her own destruction. I picked up the manila folder. "All right, Chelsea," I said softly. "I won't bring it up again." 3 days later, on Friday morning, a courier arrived at the office of Diane Yates, my personal attorney. He delivered a thick legal filing. Chelsea had officially petitioned the Harris County Family Court for a dissolution of marriage. Attached to the divorce papers was a formal corporate notice from Chelsea's legal counsel, informing me that my executive contract as VP of Operations was under review for immediate termination, effective on the date of the upcoming brand launch event. She thought she was cutting off an anchor. She had no idea she had just released the lock on the dam. 30 minutes after the courier delivered Chelsea's divorce petition and my termination notice, Diane Yates walked into my warehouse office. Diane was 47 years old, dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer, carrying a thick leather briefcase. She was a veteran corporate and family law attorney who had known my father for over 2 decades. She wasn't the kind of lawyer who made speeches in front of television cameras. She was the kind who found the fatal flaw on page 92 of a commercial contract and used it to quietly dismantle an opponent. She pulled up a metal chair across from my desk, put on her reading glasses, and reviewed Chelsea's legal filings line by line. "It's aggressive, Vincent," Diane said, setting the papers down. "They're using standard corporate isolation tactics. Chelsea's counsel is filing for a clean dissolution of marriage, alleging irreconcilable business differences. By tying your employment termination directly to the divorce agreement, they're trying to lock you out of the company's premises before you can examine the quarterly financial audits." She looked at me over her glasses. "If you want to fight this in family court, we can file a counterpetition today. We can request a temporary restraining order to freeze the company's executive decisions until an independent receiver is appointed." "No," I said quietly. "If we drag this into family court, the litigation will take 6 months. Derrick and Vance Hospitality will strip the company's remaining assets clean before a judge ever reads the first motion. By the time the court settles the divorce, Bishop Culinary Group will be an empty shell with millions in defaulted debt." "So what do you want to do?" Diane asked. "I'm not fighting for the marriage, Diane," I said. That ended the moment Chelsea smiled at Derrick in front of our board. But Harold Bishop gave me a chance when I needed one, and 300 people work in our processing plant and restaurant kitchens. I'm going to save the company. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out an encrypted laptop, and turned it toward her. I opened the master bank account summary for Fieldstone Holdings, LLC, the legal corporate vehicle I had quietly registered 18 months prior to receive the licensing royalties from Harvest Line Technologies. Diane leaned in, staring at the screen. Her eyes widened slightly as her fingers tapped against her briefcase. The account balance showed $6,420,000 in liquid cash, backed by short-term treasury bills. "Where did this come from?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "Harvest Line," I replied. "Over 30 commercial food processors and butcher networks across Texas are licensing my atmospheric preservation protocols. Chelsea called it my cute little project and never looked at the statements. I haven't spent a single dollar of it." Diane stared at the screen for a full minute, then slowly closed her laptop. A tight, approving smile formed on her lips. "Vincent," she said softly, "you are the most underappreciated man in Harris County. What is your plan?" "Bishop Culinary Group is drowning in short-term debt," I explained, pulling out a folder of our internal bank obligations. 18 months ago, when our cash reserves started dipping, Chelsea signed a secondary credit facility with Texas Commercial Bank for $4 million. She pledged 80% of the company's voting, shares, and primary property deeds as collateral. "Did they default on the covenant ratios?" Diane asked, instantly catching my drift. 2 weeks ago," I said. "Our cash flow dipped below the mandatory interest coverage ratio required by the bank loan agreement. Chelsea doesn't even realize it yet, because Derrick has been hiding the bank notices in a pending administrative file. Texas Commercial Bank sent a formal notice of technical default last Tuesday. They are terrified of holding a bad commercial loan on a restaurant group, and they want off the debt immediately." Diane stood up, taking out a fresh yellow legal pad. "We don't buy the company from Chelsea," she said, her eyes flashing with sharp legal precision. "We buy the defaulted debt directly from Texas Commercial Bank." "Exactly," I said. "Fieldstone Holdings buys the primary loan notes at face value. The moment Fieldstone becomes the primary creditor, Texas Commercial Bank's contractual rights transfer entirely to us. Under Clause 14 of the loan agreement, a technical default allows the primary note holder to convert the debt directly into controlling voting equity and assume immediate governance, rights over the board." Diane tapped her pen against the pad. "Chelsea thinks she's firing an employee on Friday. In reality, she's handing her company's master deed to a primary creditor she doesn't know exists." "She can't know it's me," I emphasized. "If Derrick catches wind that Fieldstone Holdings is connected to me, he will accelerate his asset transfer agreement with Vance Hospitality overnight. We need Fieldstone to operate as an anonymous institutional debt buyer out of Wilmington." "Consider it done," Diane said, snapping her briefcase shut. "I will handle the bank negotiations, directly through Fieldstone's legal counsel. Texas Commercial Bank will jump at the chance to sell a defaulted $4 million loan for 100 cents on the dollar in liquid cash. We can close the debt purchase transaction within 10 business days." Over the next 2 weeks, while Chelsea and Derrick were busy hiring public relations consultants, booking velvet chairs, and ordering high-end catering for their grand, rebranding press conference at Midtown, Diane worked in silence. She dealt directly with the chief risk officer at Texas Commercial Bank. The bank was ecstatic to unload the distressed credit line without suffering a loss. On Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before the press conference, the bank signed the master loan assignment agreement. Fieldstone Holdings became the sole owner of Bishop Culinary Group's primary mortgage, equipment liens, and default credit facilities. On Thursday evening at 11:30 p.m., Diane called my phone. "It's done, Vincent," she said calmly over the line. "The wire transfer of $4,200,000 cleared 20 minutes ago. Fieldstone Holdings officially owns the debt. I've prepared the emergency board restructuring, resolution under the default covenant clauses." "What time can we legally file the equity conversion with the Harris County Clerk and the Secretary of State?" I asked. "The registry portal opens at 6 a.m., Diane answered. "The filings will be fully stamped, registered, and effective by 6:15 a.m. tomorrow morning. By the time Chelsea takes the stage at her 9 a.m. press conference, Fieldstone Holdings will legally own 82% of the company's voting equity and hold an immediate power of seizure over every asset in the building. I stood by the window of my quiet living room, looking out at the Houston skyline. "Let her have her stage tomorrow morning, Diane," I said softly. "Let her say everything she wants to say." The grand ballroom of the Midtown Houston event venue smelled of expensive floral arrangements and fresh espresso. By 8:45 a.m., every seat in the row of velvet chairs was taken. 50 reporters from Texas business journals, local news anchors, food industry bloggers, and regional private equity representatives were settled in, cameras mounted on tripods, lighting rigs focused on the main stage. Behind the podium, a giant high-definition screen displayed the company's new slogan, Bishop Culinary Group, reimagined. Derrick Pratt paced back and forth near the green room stage door. He wore a loud, patterned designer suit with an unbuttoned silk shirt, checking his gold watch every 30 seconds. He held a leather folio containing the draft agreement he planned to execute later that evening with Marcus Vance of Vance Hospitality, the agreement that would secretly strip the company of its core assets. In the front row, Joanne Bishop sat upright in a cream-colored wool dress. She leaned over to her friend from the country club, nodding toward me where I stood near the side emergency exit in my navy suit. "Look at him," Joanne whispered loud enough for 2 reporters nearby to hear. "Standing near the exit like a warehouse manager who lost his invitation. It's about time Chelsea removed that dead weight from our family's legacy." At 9 a.m. sharp, the house lights dimmed. Chelsea stepped onto the stage under the bright white spotlights. She wore a striking, fitted red dress, her dark hair styled up, every gesture practiced and polished. The room broke into polite applause as she approached the lectern. She spoke for 5 minutes about her father's founding vision, artfully weaving in corporate buzzwords about brand evolution, modernizing luxury dining, and cutting away stagnant operational paradigms. Then, right on cue, her expression hardened. She paused, looked directly at the center television camera, and pointed her index finger toward the side exit where I stood. 12 years, and this is what loyalty gets you," Chelsea said, her voice amplified crisp and clear across the sound system. "A man who needed my family's name just to hold down a job." A collective murmur rippled through the audience. Reporters leaned forward, phones raised, instantly catching the raw drama. "For 7 years, Vincent Lowry has managed our operational infrastructure," Chelsea continued, stepping out from behind the lectern to command the edge of the stage. "But a forward-thinking culinary brand cannot be anchored by a glorified warehouse operator who lacks the vision to compete in today's market. Effective immediately, Vincent is relieved of all executive duties at Bishop Culinary Group." She extended her hand toward me, her palm open, her face a mask of cold arrogance. "Hand over your master key card and walk out." I didn't flinch. I didn't drop my head or show anger. I unbuttoned my coat, walked calmly up the 3 steps onto the side of the stage, and pulled my silver master key card from my breast pocket. I laid it flat on the glass display table beside her microphone stand. Alongside it, I placed the thick, sealed white envelope I had been holding. "Is that the final, official decision of the chief executive officer?" I asked softly into the quiet space between us. Chelsea let out a short, dismissive laugh that echoed through her lapel microphone. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Vincent. Goodbye." Derrick Pratt stepped out from the stage wings, a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He adjusted his jacket, stepped up to the second microphone, and opened his mouth to deliver his prepared statement about taking over company leadership. Before Derrick could speak a single word, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. The loud thud resonated off the high ceilings. Every head in the auditorium turned, around. Diane Yates walked into the room. She wore a dark gray tailored suit, her posture rigid, carrying a black leather briefcase. Walking beside her was Arthur Pendleton, Senior Vice President of Commercial Restructuring at Texas Commercial Bank, and a certified state process server carrying a thick legal binder stamped with official state seals. Diane didn't ask for permission. She walked straight down the center aisle, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, right up to the stage. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Chelsea demanded, her voice tightening into anger. "This is a private corporate press event. Security, please escort these people out." Diane stopped at the base of the stage stairs, pulled a certified legal document from her briefcase, and held it up directly toward the media cameras. "My name is Diane Yates, legal counsel for Fieldstone Holdings, LLC," Diane announced in a clear, resonant voice that filled the entire room. "This press conference is halted under Section 11 of the Texas Commercial Default Code." The room went completely dead silent. Flashbulbs began popping wildly. "What are you talking about?" Chelsea snapped, stepping toward the front of the stage. "I don't care who you represent." Arthur Pendleton from Texas Commercial Bank stepped forward, holding his own official bank badge and folder. "Mrs. Lowry," Pendleton said firmly, "as of 5 p.m. yesterday, Bishop Culinary Group entered technical default on its $4 million primary credit facility. Under Clause 14 of your loan agreement, the bank exercised its right to assign the notes." "Assign them to whom?" Derrick demanded, his smirk instantly vanishing as he stepped down to the stage edge. "To Fieldstone Holdings, LLC," Diane answered, turning to face the row of journalists. At 6:15 a.m. this morning, the Secretary of State and the Harris County Clerk officially recorded Fieldstone Holdings' debt-to-equity conversion filing. Fieldstone Holdings has purchased 100% of Texas Commercial Bank's default notes and converted them into 82% of the voting equity of Bishop Culinary Group. Joanne Bishop gasped loudly from the front row, her hands flying to her throat. Chelsea stood frozen on stage, her color draining rapidly from her face. "That's impossible. That's a bank error. Who owns Fieldstone Holdings?" I stepped back over to the display table, picked up the sealed white envelope I had laid down 2 minutes earlier, and tore it open in front of the flashing press cameras. I pulled out the certified, state-stamped ownership certificate and held it up next to Chelsea's face. "I do, Chelsea," I said quietly. "By 6:15 a.m. this morning, I owned 82% of your company." The ballroom collapsed into immediate, absolute chaos. Flashbulbs went off in rapid bursts as reporters shouted questions, thrusting microphones over the security barrier. Derrick Pratt's face turned an ugly shade of red. He lunged toward Arthur Pendleton from Texas Commercial Bank, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is an illegal hostile takeover. That debt acquisition was executed without board approval." Diane Yates stepped calmly between Derrick and the bank officer. She opened her briefcase, pulled out a thick document with a pink court cover, and handed it directly to Derrick's chest. "It's a lawful creditor enforcement action under Texas law, Mr. Pratt," Diane said smoothly, her voice carrying over the noise. "Furthermore, this is a formal legal notice. Fieldstone Holdings has filed an emergency injunction in Harris County District Court, freezing all intellectual property transfers executed by you or Apex Culinary Partners over the past 90 days. If you attempt to access Bishop Culinary Group's servers or remove any physical files, you will be in direct violation of a court order." Derrick looked at the court notice, then at the wall of camera lenses pointed at his face. He knew the game was over. He turned on his heel, pushed past 2 stunned food bloggers, and hurried out the side exit without saying another word to Chelsea. Joanne Bishop was practically hyperventilating in the front row, clutching her pearl necklace while her country club friends stared at her in utter disbelief. Chelsea stood frozen in the middle of the stage, her arms hanging limp at her sides, staring at me as if I were a stranger who had suddenly materialized out of thin air. I didn't linger on stage to gloat or take photos. I turned to Diane and Pendleton. "Let's go to the corporate headquarters." 20 minutes later, we sat in the main third-floor executive conference room at Bishop Culinary Group. Diane, Arthur Pendleton, and 2 forensic accountants from my team opened the company's real-time financial ledger on the central projector screen. The numbers were staggering. In his rush to set up the grand press event and prepare the company for asset stripping, Derrick had authorized over $300,000 in non-refundable promotional expenditures, Worse, he had intentionally delayed paying our primary wholesale meat and produce vendors for 45 days to make the short-term balance sheet look artificially inflated for his draft deal with Vance Hospitality. Pendleton tapped his pen against the glass table. Vincent, here is the immediate operational reality. When you factor in the venue bills from this morning and the outstanding vendor demand letters, the company's master liquid checking account holds exactly $118,000. And what is our bi-weekly payroll requirement? I asked, looking at the ledger. $450,000, Diane answered softly. It covers 300 employees across the central processing plant, the warehouse docks, and our 6 regional restaurant kitchens. Payroll clears automatically at 5 p.m. on Friday. I checked my watch. It was 11 a.m. on Wednesday. We had exactly 48 hours before 300 working-class families, meat cutters, line cooks, truck drivers, and dishwashers, got hit with bounced payroll checks. If payroll failed, the plant would shut down, the restaurant staff would walk out, and the brand would suffer a catastrophic operational death from which no debt reorganization could save it. We aren't letting payroll fail, I said, standing up. Arthur, release $50,000 from Fieldstone's emergency operating reserve to satisfy the immediate utility liens. Diane, notify the vendor legal teams that Fieldstone Holdings is now the primary guarantor of all trade credit. Where are you going? Diane asked. To the place where this company actually lives, I replied. The processing plant floor. I took off my navy suit jacket, tossed it onto the conference chair, rolled up my white shirt sleeves, and walked out. By 1 p.m., I was at our main 40,000 square foot central processing facility near the Houston Ship Channel. The plant floor was cold, smelling of sanitized stainless steel and raw beef. 50 workers in white smocks and rubber boots were moving meat cuts along the conveyor lines, their faces tight with anxiety. Rumors about the disaster at the Midtown press conference had already spread through text messages. I didn't call a corporate meeting in a glass room. I walked right out onto the concrete floor, stood on an inverted plastic crates near the main cutting tables, and clapped my hands together. The room went quiet. The heavy hum of the refrigeration compressors was the only sound. "Listen up, everyone," I called out, my voice steady and plain. "You all know me. I've worked on these loading docks with you for 7 years. You've heard rumors about what happened downtown this morning. Here is the absolute truth. The press event was a mess, but the company is not closing." A tall, broad-shouldered lead butcher named Hector stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron. "Vincent, are our checks going to clear on Friday? People are saying the accounts are empty." "Your checks will clear at 5 p.m. on Friday," I said, looking Hector straight in the eye. "Every single dollar. I give you my personal word as Otis Lowry's son. But starting right now, we are changing how this plant operates." Over the next 36 hours, I didn't sleep a single minute. I brought 3 technicians from Harvest Line Technologies into the plant at 3 a.m. Thursday morning. Together, we worked side by side with our facility engineers, retrofitting our main walk-in freezers and cold chain staging lines with Harvest Line's patented environmental sensor arrays and microfiltered airflow units. By Thursday afternoon, the results were immediate and measurable. We reduced our daily inventory spoilage rate on high-grade prime cuts from 12% down to less than 1.5%. That single operational shift saved the company nearly $90,000 in raw inventory waste in less than 30 hours. At 2 a.m. on Friday morning, standing under the bright fluorescent lights of the cold storage room with grease on my shirt and dust on my work boots, I personally signed the emergency vendor agreements with Texas Prime Beef. Backed by Harvest Line's zero spoilage guarantees and Fieldstone's cash reserves, our suppliers agreed to extend our primary trade credit lines by 6 months. At 3:30 p.m. on Friday, an hour and a half before the deadline, I sat at a dusty desk in the warehouse office, opened the automated banking portal, and authorized a $500,000 capital injection from Fieldstone Holdings directly into the payroll clearing account. At 5 p.m. sharp, 300 mobile phones across the plant floor chimed simultaneously. Every paycheck had deposited in full. Hector walked into my warehouse office 10 minutes later, holding 2 paper cups of hot black coffee. He set one on my desk, looked at my exhausted face, and gave me a firm nod. "System square, boss," Hector said simply. "Thank you." "Get some rest, Hector," I said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "We've got 3 morning trucks coming in at 6. By Monday morning, the frantic momentum of the 48-hour payroll rescue had settled into a steady, disciplined operational rhythm across the central facility. The plant floor was running at full capacity. The refrigeration lines were maintaining precise atmospheric balance under Harvest Line's automated controls, and our 6 restaurant kitchens had received their fresh inventory shipments on time. I was sitting at my plain metal desk in the warehouse office at 8:30 a.m., reviewing the weekly distribution manifests, when the heavy steel door opened. There were no flashbulbs, no press handlers, and no PR consultants standing behind her. Chelsea walked into the office completely alone. She wasn't wearing her fitted red designer dress or her polished high heels. She wore a simple black cardigan, dark jeans, and flat shoes. Her hair was pulled back into a hasty ponytail, and her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes that no makeup could hide. For the first time in 7 years, she looked entirely stripped of her public persona armor. She stood near the doorway, looking at the scarred wooden chairs, the filing cabinets, and the framed blueprint of the warehouse layout hanging on the wall, the very office she had spent years dismissing as a glorified storage room. "Vincent," she said softly. Her voice lacked the sharp, theatrical confidence she had projected on stage 4 days ago. It sounded small and tired. "Chelsea," I replied, setting my pen down. "Sit down if you want." She pulled out the metal chair across from my desk, the same chair Diane Yates had sat in a week earlier, and sat down slowly. She held a plain leather handbag in her lap, her fingers gripping the strap until her knuckles turned white. "Derrick is gone," she said, looking down at her hands. "He packed his personal belongings from his apartment on Saturday night and left Houston. His phone is disconnected. His legal counsel called me yesterday morning to inform me they no longer represent him." "I know," I said quietly. Diane Yates filed federal wire fraud disclosures with the Department of Justice on Friday afternoon. Derrick realized his paper trail with Marcus Vance was fully unencrypted. He ran because he knows he's facing a federal indictment. Chelsea let out a quiet, trembling breath. Marcus Vance pulled out of the transaction the second Diane served the court injunction. He sent his attorneys to issue a formal statement, claiming Vance Hospitality was misled by Derrick and had no knowledge of any IP theft. They're washing their hands of everything. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "My mother hasn't left her house since Friday. She canceled all her country club lunches. She told me I ruined our family name in front of the entire city." I watched her face. I didn't feel a surge of vindication or joy at her collapse. I just felt a heavy, hollow sadness for the years we had wasted chasing 2 entirely different ideas of what mattered. "Joanne spent 10 years telling you that this company was built on social standing and press clippings," I said. "It wasn't. It was built on raw beef, cold storage, vendor trust, and 300 people waking up at 4 in the morning to work." Chelsea swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't look at the files, Vincent." "I know you didn't," I said. "I let Derrick interpret every single financial report for 4 months, she confessed, her voice cracking as a tear ran down her cheek. "I let him tell me what the numbers meant because it was easier than sitting down and doing the hard work of reading them myself. When you brought me that folder with the server logs, I didn't open it because I was terrified you were right. I was terrified that if I admitted Derrick was a fraud, it meant I was a fraud too." She covered her face with her hands for a moment, her shoulders shaking as she wept quietly in the small office. The hum of the plant's external refrigeration units filled the silence between us. After a few minutes, she wiped her face with a tissue from her purse and looked at me directly. "The divorce petition," she whispered. and firing you on stage in front of those 50 reporters. Deep down, I knew it wasn't really about saving the company. Then why did you do it, Chelsea? I asked, keeping my voice level. Because I wanted to prove something, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ever since my father got sick, every time I walked into a room of investors or regional owners, I could feel them looking at me like I was just Harold Bishop's pretty daughter who inherited a title she didn't earn. My mother kept whispering in my ear that I was letting a butcher's son run my father's legacy behind the scenes. She wiped another tear from her eye. I wanted to stand on that stage, pull that card from your hand and show everyone, my mother, the press, the city, and myself, that I didn't need anyone to hold up this company. I thought that if I publicly cut you off, it would prove I was in total control. You traded reality for perception, Chelsea, I said. You wanted the authority of a founder without doing the invisible work that keeps the doors open. You can't run a food enterprise on confidence and press releases. Meat spoils whether you have a good PR campaign or not. She looked around the quiet warehouse office, her posture sinking. What happens now, Vincent? Are you going to sue me? Are you going to take everything left in the divorce? I don't care about your personal assets, Chelsea, I answered calmly. I don't want your house, your car, or your mother's country club bonds. But I own 82% of Bishop Culinary Group, and I hold every dollar of its primary corporate debt. I'm going to run this business the way your father intended it to be run. She nodded slowly, accepting the reality she could no longer deny or manipulate. What do you want from me? I have one single condition, I said, leaning forward across the desk. What condition? Chelsea asked, her voice hovering somewhere between deep fear and complete exhaustion. You will officially tender your written resignation as Chief Executive Officer of Bishop Culinary Group to the Board of Directors, I said, looking her straight in the eyes. And before you walk out of this company for the last time, you will go down to the central processing facility, stand on the concrete floor in front of Hector and the 300 employees whose payroll you nearly destroyed, and you will publicly apologize to them. Chelsea blinked, taken aback. An apology? To the plant workers? To every single person who wears a white smock and rubber boots in that building, I said firmly. You put their livelihoods, their mortgages, and their families' futures at risk because you were too proud to look at a financial spreadsheet. If you do that, honestly, without a PR script, a media camera, or an audience of reporters, Fieldstone Holdings will execute a full legal release. I will not file civil lawsuits against you for corporate waste, gross negligence, or breach of fiduciary duty. She looked at me for a long, heavy moment. She realized the weight of what I was offering. A civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty would have tied her up in court for years, drained her remaining personal savings, and exposed every single text message and email between her and Derrick Pratt to the public record. Okay, she whispered, her chin trembling slightly. I'll do it. On Wednesday morning at 10 a.m., the heavy hum of the main refrigeration compressors echoed through the cold storage warehouse. All 300 employees, meat cutters, packagers, forklift operators, dock workers, and line cooks, gathered in a wide circle around the central staging area. The air was cold, smelling of sanitized stainless steel, raw beef, and fresh pine sawdust. Chelsea walked out onto the concrete floor. She wasn't carrying a wireless microphone, wearing designer clothing, or standing behind a velvet barrier. She wore simple dark clothes, stepping up onto the exact same inverted plastic crate I had stood on 6 days earlier. I stood near the back loading dock with my arms crossed, watching quietly beside my attorney, Diane Yates. Chelsea looked out at the 300 hard-working faces staring up at her. She cleared her throat, swallowed hard, and opened her mouth. I didn't bring any reporters or cameras today, Chelsea began, her voice echoing off the high insulated walls. I came here because I owe every single one of you an apology. Over the last 4 months, I made severe mistakes in judgment. I trusted a fraud who almost wiped out this company's operating capital. and I turned a blind eye to the hard work you do here every single day." The room remained deathly quiet. Nobody clapped. Nobody jeered. "Many of you worked with my father, Harold," she continued, her voice shaking slightly but remaining clear and audible. "My father respected this plant, and he respected the people who kept it running. I lost sight of that because I was focused on vanity, press coverage, and empty appearances. Your payroll cleared last Friday because Vincent stepped in to fix what I broke. I am officially resigning as CEO, and I am leaving the leadership of this company in the hands of the man who actually built its foundation. I am truly sorry for the stress and uncertainty I brought upon your lives." She stepped down from the plastic crate. Hector, standing near the front row in his blood-stained apron, looked at her for a long moment, gave her a slow, respectful nod of acknowledgement, and turned back to his cutting table. Chelsea walked past the workers toward the side exit door. As she passed me, she paused for a brief second. "Thank you, Vincent," she whispered quietly. "Good luck, Chelsea," I replied softly. She stepped through the heavy metal door and walked out into the morning light. While Chelsea was taking accountability for her actions on the plant floor, the legal net was tightening rapidly around Derrick Pratt. On Thursday afternoon, Diane Yates met directly with federal prosecutors at the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Texas. She delivered 40 gigabytes of verified server logs, encrypted email chains, and draft contracts proving that Derrick had engaged in interstate wire, fraud, and the unauthorized transmission of proprietary commercial trade secrets to Vance Hospitality. Federal agents executed a search warrant on Derrick's luxury rented apartment in Midtown Houston late Friday morning. They found the place completely abandoned. Derrick had cleared out his closet, emptied his local bank accounts, and abandoned his leased sports car in the apartment garage. Federal warrants were immediately issued for his arrest under charges of wire fraud and corporate asset theft. 2 days after the press conference disaster, Derrick Pratt was a wanted federal fugitive, fleeing across state lines with a ruined reputation and a federal indictment hanging over his head. 6 weeks later, I sat beside Diane Yates in a quiet, wood-paneled courtroom at the Harris County Family Law Center. Chelsea sat across the aisle with her sole remaining family law attorney. There were no raised voices, no public accusations, and no dramatic courtroom arguments. I honored every single word of my agreement. I didn't ask for spousal support or alimony. I didn't attempt to claim a single dollar or percentage of Chelsea's house, her personal jewelry, her mother Joanne's country club assets, or her family's private trust accounts. I left her with everything she owned prior to our marriage. The only thing I retained was my 82% controlling voting equity in Bishop Culinary Group and the master ownership of Harvest Line Technologies, the assets I had earned, funded, and built through my own labor and systems engineering. The judge reviewed the final marital settlement agreement, signed the official court order, and stamped the decree. "The marriage between Vincent Lowry and Chelsea Lowry is officially dissolved," the judge stated, tapping his gavel down onto the wooden bench. We stood up. Chelsea looked across the aisle at me one last time. There was no anger left in her eyes, only a quiet, somber acceptance of reality. She gave me a slight nod, turned, and walked out of the courtroom with her lawyer. I picked up my leather briefcase, buttoned my navy suit jacket, and walked out into the bright Texas sunshine. 2 years have passed since that rainy Wednesday morning in the Harris County Court building. If you walk into the Midtown corporate office of Bishop Culinary Group today, you won't find high definition, presentation screens blaring promotional slogans, nor will you see velvet ropes or public relations consultants pacing through the hallways. The flashy third-floor corner office that Chelsea and Derrick once occupied has been converted into a quiet data engineering center, where our logistics team monitors real-time cold chain logistics and inventory flow across the entire Gulf Coast region. I never took that corner office for myself. Instead, I set up my desk in a modest 10 by 12-foot office at the very end of the ground floor hallway, right where the administrative building connects to the central processing facility. It has a plain wooden desk, a steel filing cabinet, and a large reinforced glass window that looks directly out onto the main plant floor. From my desk, I can look through that window every morning at 6 a.m. and see Hector and 50 meat cutters in their clean white smocks, moving with practiced rhythmic efficiency along the stainless steel cutting lines. I can see the blue LED indicators of our harvest line environmental control units, glowing steadily along the cold storage walls, keeping moisture and temperature in perfect, microfiltered balance. I like sitting here because this is where the truth of the business lives. You can't fake a yield margin when you're looking at the cutting table, and you can't talk your way around a bad refrigeration unit. Under our redesigned operational framework, Harvest Line Technologies was fully integrated into every level of Bishop Culinary Group's supply chain. We eliminated third-party distributor markups, cut inventory spoilage to under 1%, and expanded our regional wholesale division to supply fresh, non-chemically preserved cuts to 80 independent upscale restaurants across Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. Last month, our Chief Financial Officer delivered the audited fiscal summary for the second year, following the debt restructuring. Bishop Culinary Group recorded its highest net profit margin in the company's 40-year history, surpassing even the peak operational years when Harold Bishop ran the business at his healthiest. Every single employee at the plant and across our 6 restaurant locations now shares in a quarterly profit distribution pool. We haven't missed a single payroll clearing date by so much as a minute. A few months ago, I drove out to a quiet residential care facility in Woodlands to visit Harold Bishop. He was sitting in a wheelchair on the sunlit back patio, a heavy blanket over his lap, looking out at the gardens. His speech was still slow and slurred from the stroke he had suffered 7 years prior, but his mind was sharp and clear. I sat in a wicker chair beside him, placed our latest quarterly report on his lap, and spent an hour walking him through the plant's production numbers, the vendor ledgers, and the new distribution routes. Harold listened quietly, his weathered eyes tracking the lines on the balance sheet. When I finished speaking, he reached out his trembling right hand, placed it over mine, and squeezed it tightly. "You kept the frame square, Vincent," Harold said, his voice raspy but firm. "Thank you for saving my work." "I just did the job right, Harold," I told him softly. "That's all." As for Chelsea, she moved out of her grand residence in River Oaks a year ago and bought a small townhouse in Austin. She completely retired from the public corporate circuit, stepping away from media interviews and executive galas. She opened a small, independent interior arrangement studio, focusing quietly on local residential projects without the pressure of maintaining a corporate empire. Her mother, Joanne, tried for a while to maintain her social circle at the country club, but the scandal of Derrick Pratt's federal indictment and Chelsea's public resignation permanently cooled her standing among Houston's elite socialites. Eventually, Joanne sold her large house and moved to Florida, spending her days away from the city where her family's name had once dominated the business headlines. Derrick Pratt didn't make it very far. 8 months after fleeing Texas, he was apprehended by federal marshals at a residential hotel near Atlanta, Georgia, operating under a false alias. He was extradited back to Houston, tried in federal court on 3 counts of wire fraud and corporate trade secret theft, and sentenced to 6 years in a federal penitentiary. Sometimes, late on Friday afternoons when the plant floor quieted down and the last delivery trucks departed the loading bay, I sat at my desk and thought about the morning of that press conference. For a long time, Chelsea believed that authority came from standing on a brightly lit stage under a spotlight, holding a wireless microphone, and issuing commands in front of 50 recording cameras. She believed that a title printed on an executive business card conferred true power, and that quiet men who worked in cold rooms were easily replaced. She was wrong. A signature on a legal deed or a title on a corporate registry only gives you legal ownership of a company. It doesn't give you respect, and it certainly doesn't keep the machinery running when the lights go down. True authority isn't built in public speeches or flashy brand campaigns. It is built in the dark, quiet hours when nobody is taking photos, nobody is clapping, and nobody is watching. It is built by the man who sits at his desk, until 9 p.m. balancing vendor ledgers, the engineer who stays up all night retrofitting a freezer sensor to save 10% on spoilage, and the worker who stands on a cold concrete floor at 5 in the morning to make sure the cuts are clean. My father, Otis Lowry, knew that truth 30 years ago when he wiped down his butcher block in South Houston. He didn't have a corporate title or a media handler, but he understood the fundamental rule of real work. If you build the frame square, fit the joints tight, and do the job careful and quiet, your work will stand long after the loudest voices in the room have faded into silence. I turned off my desk lamp, picked up my leather jacket, and walked out through the quiet warehouse into the evening air.